So now we're going to turn to the two last lessons from practice in the panel that will conclude that discussion. And so we're going to move to Rony Hacohen, who's going to be coming here to talk to us from the Behavioural Insights team in the UK. And we heard Iris Bonet already talking about some of the things that they've been doing in the UK, but now we have Rony to come and tell us from the inside, kind of the nitty-gritty inside story of exactly how these initiatives in the UK can actually lead to improvements. So I'd like to invite Rony to the stage. Thank you very much.
All right. Hi, everyone. How's everyone feeling? Yeah. So I flew in from the UK, obviously, and that means that my brain thinks it's about 9 now, and it kind of wants to just kind of crawl into bed and cuddle with my cat and not really talk to you at all. But rather than doing that, I will tell you in 13 minutes how to solve the gender pay gap in the UK. Or at least what we're trying to do to help. So what I'll really be talking about is how we've been trying to apply BI to reduce the gender pay gap in the UK. And I'm going to start with a bit of really good news. I think this crowd could use a bit of good news. As many of you probably already know, since last April, all employers with more than 250 employees in the UK are required to submit their gender pay gap figures on an online portal that the public can see. And how many people, raise your hand if you think that the majority of employers indeed disclose their figures. Raise your hand if you think majority of employers put their figures out. Okay, leave your hand up, the 3 optimists in the room, if you think that every single employer submitted their figures. Every single employer that was required by law to submit their figures and indeed did so. That's really encouraging. It's encouraging maybe because employers are a bit scared, or because they care, probably more because they're scared. Probably because they kind of figured out the behavioral insight that if you don't disclose something negative that you're supposed to disclose, people think the worst about you. It's a bit of work by Leslie John and others. The other really good piece of good news in this respect is that it's not just that employers have submitted the figures, it's also that the public really cares. So the gender pay gap, according to the global comms company Golan, has rivaled the royal wedding as one of the biggest stories of 2018. So it's really been up there as one of the biggest stories in the beginning of the year, together with the Me Too movement. That's quite striking, isn't it? That's quite good news. These 2 pieces of information were very surprising to government. No one thought compliance would be 100%, and when this came out, people were literally screaming in the government offices, like, what? So this is fantastic. A few months before these regulations came into force, we started a program called the Gender and Behavioural Insights Program, which is effectively a partnership between us at the Behavioural Insights team and the Government Equalities Office in the UK. To remind, the Behavioural Insights team is really the first behavioural science unit set up particularly in government to focus on government policy. And we are now a social purpose company. Since 2014, we've run trials across different policy areas, around 600 of them to date, and increasingly we're taking on more complex problems like gender equality. The Government Equalities Office leads work on policy relating to women's sexual orientation and transgender equality, and is responsible for the gender pay gap reporting regulations. So we set up this program really to take Iris's, Professor Bonet's challenge very seriously. So at the heart of our program, what we're trying to do is improve the evidence base on what works to improve gender equality with a real focus on the workplace. That's all very vague. I'll talk to you about 3 concrete challenges we're taking on in this program. And I've really ordered these from kind of the smallest challenge to the biggest challenge that we have. The first one is that the public doesn't quite get the gender pay gap yet. And we think it's important that the public does get what the gender pay gap means, because in the end, they will need to hold companies accountable. And the second is that many employers have indeed submitted their figures, but actually aren't quite sure where to start. And the last is, as you've probably established already today, that the evidence base on what actually works is rather patchy. And we're trying to kind of tackle these three things, and I'll talk now about what we've been doing in those kind of three areas. So to start with the first challenge, the public doesn't quite get the gender pay gap. 2/3 of the population still think that the gender pay gap and equal pay are the same things. They're not the same thing. So equal pay is paying people that do similar things differently. The gender pay gap is really a comparison between the average hourly wage of a man and a woman in an organization. So it's quite different. It's really reflective in a much broader sense of the power dynamic in an organization. And as I said before, we think it's important that the public understand what the gender pay gap means so it can hold companies accountable. But also if you look a bit at the kind of behavioral economics literature, so work specifically by Cass Sunstein and George Lowenstein and others, they kind of look at cases in which mandatory disclosure kind of doesn't work at all and when it does work. And they have three main lessons. And they say, well, when mandatory disclosure works, it's usually in the following cases. When information then is then put out is simple, easy to understand. So think of cases in which you've signed lots of complex things and you didn't understand anything. Of course, disclosure was useless. You couldn't understand it. The second is when it was meaningful. So when people care about the information they've been shown, people care about the gender pay gap. So that's great. And the third is when it's comparative in the sense that it allows people to understand what good and bad means. And with these kinds of insights in mind, what we did is design an experiment to kind of help the government design the way in which it would put out the information for people to see. I can't talk you through all of this online experiment, but I'll talk you through kind of two insights. So first of all, this is the website in which you can kind of go in and click and look at all the gender pay gaps of different companies. It's rather fun. I encourage you to do so. This is the wording that is used to describe the gender pay gap in the legislation and also in the website. So it kind of goes, women's mean hourly rate is 13% lower than men's. We know in behavioral science that people hate percentages. It makes them think of math class and feel bad about themselves, and it makes them disengage. And so in our experiment, what we found, perhaps unsurprisingly to people in this room, is that when you say this, in other words, when comparing mean hourly rates, women earn 87p for every £1 that men earn. This increased comprehension and also engagement. So people were more likely to want to come back to the website. So if you go on the website, you'll see that both of these things are currently in there. That's one thing that came out. The other thing is that we found that in the experiment is that people are angry at gender pay gaps. But they still don't quite know what good and bad means. So they're equally angry at a 37% gender pay gap and an 18% gender pay gap. Whatever number that is kind of away from zero, they're very angry at. So people can't quite identify what is good and bad yet. And so what we're thinking about doing now is adding more kind of comparison tools into the website to help people kind of compare companies. Yeah, so you can look at a bit more at the study, and the link is there at the bottom. The next challenge is really that employers aren't sure where to start. And it's not that surprising that employers aren't sure where to start. So for many of them, this is the first time they've been thinking about this problem. Not all of the companies are those big companies that have thrown lots of diversity initiatives at their staff and kind of see nothing happen. Many just haven't thought of this. Others have indeed not seen change at all. Many companies haven't even looked at their data in a way that's meaningful enough to understand where the problems are coming from, so of course they don't know where to start. And so we're thinking, well, what can we do to make it as easy as possible for employers to at least know where to start? Well, the first rule in behavior change is make it easy for people. It's absolutely the first rule. So quite an obvious one. We put out some guidance. The guidance is called Reducing the Gender Pay Gap and Improving Gender Equality in Organizations, Evidence-Based Actions for Employers. You can look at it online just by Googling these words or using the link at the bottom. And what it does, it at least summarizes where we are in terms of what we do know that works and doesn't work. And really what we did in this guidance is take all the many actions that organizations are already doing, plus actions that we think have enough evidence behind them, and we group them into kind of three categories. The first category is effective actions. So actions tested in real-world setting and found to have a positive impact. The second is promising actions. This is actions that require further research, but we think might take us in the right direction. So we have theoretical reasons or some evidence or some kind of logical model why we think they might work, but actually, sorry, we have no evidence, so evaluate if you're doing them is the main message. The last is actions with mixed results. So these are actions that have shown to have sometimes positive impact, sometimes a negative impact, and sometimes no impact at all, but definitely need further evaluation. So if you're doing them because they've backfired in some settings, absolutely evaluate. Here's a quick summary of all of the actions. I won't talk through all of these actions because I just don't have the time. I have 5 minutes left. But what I will do is kind of a few reflections on this. If you look at the top category, what you're really seeing here is lots of actions to do with transparency, accountability, and structure. This has really come up a lot today. Ignore maybe the first action, but all the rest are really, really to do with those three principles. So lack of structure and formality is how bias creeps in. And transparency and accountability are really the things that kind of help our minds slow down. So when biases creep in, it's usually when we're kind of making very quick decisions or we don't have perfect information. But when we need to kind of follow a very clear set of criteria, we need to justify our decisions to someone else, that's how you solve bias. So that's kind of what you're seeing there at the top. Things in the middle, so promising actions, are more things that, like, for instance, shared parental leave. So we know that gender pay gaps opens up quite dramatically after women have children. So we think that if men and women shared these responsibilities more equally, that would reduce the gender pay gap. But we have no studies, so it's in the middle. And then the last, there's been so much talk about unconscious bias training and diversity training, so I don't want to repeat it, but basically what we've been saying here, and when we've been running webinars, we're having a credible attention after putting this guidance out, and we've run webinars to explain this evidence to a lot of organizations, and we've been saying, look, unconscious bias training and diversity training can be good for awareness, for increasing awareness. They might be, and maybe that's what you need in your organizations, we don't know. But in some settings, they have been backfired, so please be careful and evaluate them if you're doing them. That's been the message, and some organizations have decided to completely not do these things because they're scared. But they are definitely reacting well to this evidence. We can see that the conversation is kind of being, has been changed after this guidance, which is really encouraging. Okay. Might be not working, or am I? Shit. Oh, okay. So the last biggest problem really is that the evidence base out there is patchy, and this is definitely not taking this on by ourselves. The whole academic community is doing the hard work, but what we're trying to do a bit in this area is to contribute, to be a bit helpful. And so what we've been doing is partnering with lots of large organizations to run field trials with them and improve the evidence base to see what works. And the incredible thing about this regulation, the demand to actually do these types of creative interventions and think differently and analyze data has just exploded, because organizations need to know what to do to reduce the numbers. And so we have now signed data sharing agreements with, I think, five different big organizations, and we can't choose between the one. We have spot for one more. We can't choose. There is more demand for what we're doing at the moment than we are able to supply. That's how great it is. Organizations want to give us their data to analyze. That's what's happening. And so I can't take you through any trial results because these things take time, but what I will do is talk you through a bit about our methodology. I don't think I'm going to have time, but maybe in the panel I can share some insights from this early work. We start with a bit of explore work, so companies give us their data, and we kind of look at recruitment data, performance evaluation data, promotion data, and we try and identify biases. Where we find the strongest biases, that's where we will then focus on an intervention based on the best academic evidence, and we bring in expert academics, such as Professor Bonnet's team, to advise us on exactly how to do these interventions well. And then in the end, we run actual field trials. Partners that work with us sign at the beginning an agreement that means that whatever the outcome of the trial, it will be published. So if it backfires, if it's a null effect, if it's helpful, whatever we do will be published, which is fantastic. And I mean, they can remain anonymous in these reports, but they know that the results will be published, which is fantastic. I'm going to skip the next slide because I don't have time because I want to finish. I might talk about this in the panel later. People are interested, but I just want to end with some more good news. So, people from every single country in the world, apart from North Korea, have entered the gender pay gap viewing service to look at the different gender pay gaps. Every single country. And we know that lots of countries are currently considering introducing same legislation, which means that really the great opportunities that we have now in the UK are going to expand to more countries. I think that is really going to be fantastic in terms of our ability to progress on what works. Thank you very much.